In the dry heart of the frontier, where even shadows felt thirsty and men trusted only what they could see over a rifle's sight, there lived a rancher named Jed Hollis. He wasn't a hero, not the kind that made it into dime novels. Just a man who kept to himself, spoke little, and understood that kindness out here was a currency more dangerous than gold. But one blistering afternoon, as the wind carried dust like knives and the sun peeled the land raw, Jed did something that would shatter the fragile quiet of his world. He gave water to a stranger. The man had stumbled out of the horizon like a ghost, clothes torn, skin cracked, and eyes wild with heat. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Jed saw the tremble in his hands, the way his knees buckled at the gate, and without hesitation, filled a tin cup with water from his own barrel and held it to the man's lips. In the West, that gesture could cost you your land or your life, because you never knew who was watching, or who that stranger truly was. Jed didn't ask where the man came from, or what he had done. He didn't pull a gun, though he could have. He just gave water and walked away. A simple act, maybe even foolish. But what followed was anything but simple, because as twilight settled and the desert cooled, a low rumble began to rise from beyond the ridgelines. And before the stars could scatter across the sky, 200 warriors appeared, mounted and silent, surrounding Jed's barn like a storm that didn't need thunder. The town would later call a standoff, though not a single shot was fired. No words exchanged, no demands made. Just stillness. Eyes locked. History hanging in the air like smoke from a fire yet to be lit. But Jed didn't flinch. He stood on that porch, the same place he'd offered water just hours before, and waited. Because sometimes, the land itself knows when a man has done something sacred. And sometimes, so do the warriors. What happened that night would be etched into the memory of the valley forever. A story that began with dust and ended with something far more powerful than fear. Stay with me, because what unfolded in the silence between one man and 200 riders wasn't about war. It was about something the West rarely offered, a second chance. Jed Hollis had seen strange things in his lifetime. He'd watched wolves circle a dying horse without striking. He'd seen a dust devil rip the roof off a church and leave the cross untouched. But nothing prepared him for the sight of 200 warriors dismounting in absolute silence. No weapons drawn, no war cries, no banners. Just eyes, watching him, the same way a canyon watches a drop of water fall. It wasn't fear that rooted Jed to his porch. It was the deep, gnawing sense that something ancient had awakened, and he had somehow stepped into it. The man he'd given water to was nowhere in sight, vanished like a mirage once the thirst was quenched. But Jed knew, deep down, with the instinct that keeps men alive and places maps still feared to name, that this was connected. These warriors weren't lost. They didn't come by accident. They were here because of that single act of mercy. And yet, the question loomed larger than the riders themselves. Was it enough to save him? Or had he unknowingly invited judgment to his own doorstep? He stepped off the porch slowly, boots crunching against dry earth, the weight of 200 stairs pressing down like a mountain. The air was still, so still that the distant howl of a coyote sounded like thunder. Jed didn't raise his hands. He didn't bow. He stood tall, weathered hat casting a shadow across his brow, and waited. That was all he could do. He had no words that would matter. Not here. Not now. This wasn't about language. It was about memory. About choices made without knowing who might be watching. From among the ranks, one rider stepped forward. An older man, face painted in the deep earth tones of his people, eyes sharp but not angry. He looked Jed over, then knelt on one knee and touched the ground in front of the rancher's boots. A ritual? A warning? Jed didn't know. But when the elder stood again, his hand held the empty tin cup Jed had used earlier that day. The same cup that had touched the lips of a dying man. Without a word, the warrior placed the cup on the barn steps and stepped back. And then, as if summoned by that gesture alone, the entire group turned, 200 strong, and vanished into the night with the same silence they'd arrived with. Not a single horse neighed. Not a twig snapped. Just dust kicked up in a perfect line, fading under moonlight. Jed stood frozen, heart pounding like a war drum. He didn't understand it yet. But the West had just whispered something sacred in his direction, and nothing on his land would ever feel the same again. The next morning, the barn door creaked louder than usual. Not because it was old. It had always been old. But because Jed's ears were still ringing from the silence of the night before. He fed the animals, poured water into troughs, and fixed a broken hinge. Routine helped, but nothing could shake the image of that tin cup sitting there like a relic. He hadn't touched it. Couldn't. It wasn't his anymore. It belonged to whatever had happened under the stars, and to the men who bore witness to it. Word spread fast in a town like Dustwell. By noon, Marshal Rigg had ridden out, chewing tobacco like it owed him a favor. "You planning to explain why your place looked like a war camp last night?" he asked, squinting into the sun. Jed said nothing for a long time. Then he answered the only way he could. "Gave a man some water," he muttered. The marshal stared at him like he'd confessed to harboring a ghost. "You gave what to who?" Jed didn't elaborate. There was no point. Men like Rigg only understood power that came with bullets. But others came, too. Not lawmen. Not gossips. Just folks who felt something had changed. An old widow left flowers by the gate. A schoolboy drew a hawk in the dirt near the fence and whispered, "They were here." No one taught him that. He just knew. The land had spoken, and its voice carried in unexpected ways. Jed didn't claim to be chosen. He wasn't chosen. He was just there when the moment came, and he didn't look away. Later that week, Jed found something strange on the edge of his property. A ring of stones, perfectly shaped, with a single eagle feather laid in the center. It wasn't a threat. It was a mark, a sign that the warriors hadn't come for vengeance, but for verification. They had seen a gesture so rare in their world, and his, that it demanded acknowledgement. They'd seen a man act without reason, without strategy, without fear, and in doing so, he crossed an invisible border between worlds. Jed didn't become famous. There were no medals, no songs. But the barn changed, not just in how it looked, but in how it felt, as if the air inside had thickened with something older than wood and nails. The animals rested quieter. Strangers paused when they passed it. And Jed, well, he started keeping a second tin cup by the well, cleaned and waiting. Because in the Old West, you never knew who might stumble out of the dust next, or what their thirst might awaken. Days turned to weeks, and yet the memory of that night lingered like smoke that refused to drift. Jed would catch himself staring toward the ridge at dusk, half expecting the warriors to return, not in anger, but as guardians of a story still unfinished. He wasn't haunted. Not exactly. But something had shifted. His land didn't just carry the weight of cattle or harvest anymore. It carried presence, as if the earth itself had opened its eyes. One afternoon, as Jed patched a fence post near the south line, a shadow passed behind him. He turned to see a young woman, no older than 20, standing barefoot in the dust. Her dress was worn, her braid long, and around her neck hung a medallion etched with symbols Jed didn't recognize, but his gut did. She didn't ask permission. She simply approached the barn, touched its doorway, and whispered a word he couldn't understand. Then she turned to Jed and said, "You gave life to one who was marked. The people remember." Her voice held the stillness of stone. She handed him a pouch filled with dried leaves and small bone carvings. "Protection," she said, "for what comes next." And then, like the warriors before her, she vanished. No sound of footsteps, no trail. Just the wind, heavy with the scent of sage and something deeper, ancestral. That night, Jed sat by his fire with the pouch in his lap. He didn't open it. Not yet. It wasn't time. Instead, he watched the flames dance and wondered what it meant to give water to a man whose very presence summoned an army. Was it a test? A warning? Or had he been part of something bigger? Something the frontier itself had orchestrated? Jed didn't need answers. He just needed to keep listening. Because the West, for all its cruelty and grit, had a strange way of speaking to those who paid attention. Not with voices, but with signs. Dust trails that led nowhere. Feathers on fence posts. Tin cups filled not with water, but with meaning. And Jed Hollis, quiet, rugged, and alone, was beginning to realize that his land, his barn, and his life had been chosen not by men, but by story itself. And stories, they always demand more. The next season brought storms. Heavy rains rolled through the valley, carving new paths into the dry land like veins on an aging hand. Most saw as nature's fury, just weather, nothing more. But Jed sensed different. The wind carried more than moisture. It carried messages. He found new tracks near his north field, hoof prints arranged in deliberate patterns, never crossing over. No cattle would move like that. No man either. It was a signature. And then came the stranger. Not a warrior this time, nor a child of painted rock. He was white, dressed like a trader but walked like a soldier. Broad-shouldered, smooth talker, the kind that could sell a Bible to the devil and make him say thank you. He introduced himself as Mercer. Said he was looking for stories. Real ones, he smiled. The kind the wind still carries. Jed didn't trust him, not because of his words, but because of what he didn't say. He asked about the barn, about the warriors. Too much detail, too much knowing. Mercer wasn't here to hear the story. He was here to own it. There's value in legends, he said, hands smooth as silk. And what you've got here, Mr. Hollis, is a legend in the making. With the right backing, we could build it into something big. Jed said nothing. He only walked over to the barn, placed his hand on its side, and looked back at the man. Some stories ain't for sale, he replied. Mercer's smile faded. You'll change your mind, he muttered. But he was wrong, because Jed had come to understand something Mercer never would. That not every tale was meant to be printed, filmed, or sold. Some were meant to be felt, to be carried in silence, shared by firelight, or whispered across generations. The barn wasn't an artifact, it was an altar, and the moment you try to profit from it, you broke what made it sacred. The rains passed, and Mercer left, empty-handed. But the barn remained, steady, unbending, a relic not of ownership, but of offering. And as Jed repaired a broken shutter that same evening, a hawk passed overhead, circling slow, steady. It let out a single cry, sharp and hollow, and vanished into the clouds. Jed smiled. The land was still speaking, and he was still listening. Spring gave way to a summer that came hotter than usual, thick with restless wind and a sky that never blinked. Jed Hollis rose with the sun and rested only when it sank. But even in routine, he felt a shift. The barn no longer belonged solely to him. It belonged to a greater rhythm, something older than barbed wire and property lines. Strangers still passed through, but they came with reverence now. Some didn't even speak. They just stood beneath the rafters, touched the beam where the tin cup once sat, and moved on. One evening, just as the light bled gold over the fields, a painted rock elder returned, tall, wrapped in a weather-worn cloak, walking with the deliberate steps of a man who'd buried many winters. His name was Sahel. Jed remembered him from the night the warriors came, though he'd never spoken a word. Now, Sahel came alone, but he wasn't empty-handed. In his arms, he carried a bundle, wrapped in deer hide, stitched with hawk feathers and river stones. He offered no explanation, only looked Jed in the eyes and said, "You made a place for peace to walk. This belongs here." Inside the bundle was a ceremonial staff, smoothed by years of touch, etched with symbols of rain, fire, and silence. Sahel didn't ask permission. He walked straight into the barn and placed the staff upright in the center beam, anchoring it as if the earth itself had summoned it home. When he left, Jed followed him to the edge of the field. "Why me?" he asked, the question finally escaping his chest after so many months. Sahel paused, then answered, "Because you gave without knowing who he was. Because mercy born of ignorance is the truest kind. The earth watches those moments." And with that, he turned and vanished into the dusk, leaving Jed with more questions and something else. Confirmation that what he felt had been real all along. That night, a strange calm settled over the land. Coyotes didn't howl. Horses didn't stir. The air held a hush deeper than sleep. Jed sat under the stars beside the barn, staring at the staff that now stood like a spine at its heart. It wasn't about a man and a cup anymore. It was about something far greater. A fracture in the pattern of violence. A moment where the Old West chose something different and remembered it. By mid-autumn, the barn had taken on a life of its own. The town of Dustwell whispered of it like sacred ground. Children dared each other to touch the staff inside and swore they heard a hum. Elderly settlers, once hardened by blood feuds, now passed by in silence, some even bowing their heads. And Jed, who once believed his life would end as quietly as it began, found himself at the center of a story that refused to stop growing. One afternoon, a schoolteacher from 3 towns over-arrived with her students. They came not to gawk, but to listen. She'd heard rumors and wanted the children to understand what kindness costs and what it gives. Jed hesitated. He'd never seen himself as a storyteller. But as he stood before the barn, surrounded by young eyes and dusty boots, he realized the tale wasn't his anymore. It was theirs. And so he spoke, not with flair or poetry, but plainly. About the stranger, the cup, the silence that followed. The children didn't fidget. They didn't interrupt. They listened like the land had listened that day. One girl, no older than 10, stepped forward and placed a smooth river stone at the base of the staff. "So it remembers us too," she whispered. That night, Jed found 10 more stones laid beside it. By week's end, there were over 50. Each one a tiny vow that the story would not fade. But with reverence came curiosity, and with curiosity came danger. One night, tracks appeared again by the barn, this time not in ceremony, but in haste. Boot prints, not moccasins. Fresh tobacco scattered in the dirt. Someone had come too close. Not to learn, but to take. Jed waited under the stars with his rifle across his lap, heart steady, eyes sharp. But the thief never returned. Maybe the presence that guarded the barn had made itself known. As the wind shifted and leaves turned to gold, Jed walked the perimeter of his land and realized he hadn't felt fear in weeks. The world beyond Dust Well still spun wild, ruled by greed and grief. But here, in this small stretch of soil, something sacred had taken root. And as long as the barn stood, as long as the staff stood within it, that sacred thread would hold, woven not from power, but from a cup of water offered to a stranger in dust. Winter crept in without warning. No blizzards or storms, just a slow stilling of life. The sky hung lower, the nights arrived earlier, and every sound seemed sharper in the cold. Jed didn't mind it. He found comfort in the quiet, especially now that the barn felt more like a companion than a structure. Inside, the staff stood tall, surrounded by the stones children had left. Some had painted them, others carved tiny symbols. Together, they formed a circle of memory, one that warmed the air more than any fire could. One frosted morning, as the sun fought to rise, a rider appeared on the horizon. He wasn't tribal, nor lawman, just a solitary figure cloaked in snow, carrying a burden across his saddle. Jed met him near the barn gate. The man didn't dismount. He simply said, "They told me you'd understand." And with that, he slid down a small bundle. A boy, unconscious but breathing, wrapped in threadbare blankets. A stranger's child, left at his door not with malice, but hope. Jed didn't ask questions. He carried the boy into the barn, laid him near the haystack, and fed him warm broth until color returned to his face. The boy woke without fear, stared at the staff, then at Jed, and whispered, "I dreamed about this place." Jed only nodded. He didn't know where the boy came from, or who had sent him, but in the boy's eyes, he saw something familiar, emptiness softened by mercy. The boy stayed. Days turned into weeks. He followed Jed on chores, fed the animals, and listened to the wind with the same quiet reverence the barn had taught Jed. At night, they'd sit under wool blankets near the hearth, and Jed would tell stories. Not all of them true, but all of them meaningful. The boy never spoke of his past. Jed never asked. It wasn't needed. Some things are best left in the dust. What mattered was what was being built now, brick by brick, silence by silence. And in that winter, Jed realized something deeper than all the signs and ceremonies. The barn didn't only remember what had happened, it had become a promise of what could happen again. That giving without knowing could save lives. That offering water might bring warriors, or children. And that sometimes, the smallest acts forge the strongest legacies. The kind that survive even the frost of forgotten names. By spring, the boy had grown into the rhythm of the ranch like he'd always belonged. He learned to mend wire, to calm spooked horses, to tell the difference between a dust devil and a storm. Jed gave him no name. The boy chose his own. Ash. Not out of sadness, but remembrance. From the fire, he said one morning, pointing to the barn. "But still here." Jed smiled. It was perfect. Ash carried no bitterness, only the soft strength of something that refused to disappear. Ash began tending the stones around the staff, rearranging them each morning like a quiet ritual. Sometimes he'd hum while doing it. Old tribal tunes he claimed came to him in dreams. Other times, he'd just sit in the barn center, listening. Jed didn't interrupt. The boy wasn't just helping care for the land. He was becoming part of its language. And the land, in turn, answered back. Crops grew stronger. Animals lived longer. The barn never creaked in storms. One night, as thunder rolled in the distance, a small group arrived, travelers caught in the rain. A family, soaked and scared, clutching bags and blankets. Jed welcomed them in, gave them food, let them sleep in the hayloft. And in the morning, they wept when they saw the staff. "We heard about it," the mother whispered. Didn't think it was real. She left behind a small carved flute, laying it gently beside the stones. For the one still lost, she said. That gesture marked a new season, not just of weather, but of pilgrimage. Word of the barn had spread beyond Dustwell, not through newspapers or letters, but through whispers, trails, and wind. People who carried quiet wounds came to it. They brought offerings, stayed a night, and left lighter. Jed never turned anyone away. The barn had stopped being his long ago. He was just its caretaker now, its witness. And as spring rolled into summer once more, Jed stood beside Ash and looked across the valley. The barn, the staff, the circle of stones, it had become something no fire could erase, no greed could touch. What began with a tin cup had become a refuge for those the world had broken. And in that sacred silence, one truth rang clear. Kindness isn't forgotten by the land. It's planted. And when the time is right, it grows. Time, as it does in places where the horizon seems to stretch forever, moves slow but sure. Jed's hair had gone fully white now, his steps a little more deliberate. But his eyes, those stayed sharp, steady. Ash was older too, taller. His hands had grown callous like Jed's once were, and his voice had deepened, though he still spoke softly, like someone who didn't want to disturb the wind. The barn, ever strong, stood as though it had been there for centuries, untouched by fire or time. One morning, after the first frost had kissed the fields, Ash found something near the water trough. A hawk feather, black and silver, stuck upright in the earth. Next to it, a small symbol carved into the dirt. Not in English, not in any language Jed knew, but Ash recognized it. It means guardians, he said. That night, neither of them slept. They watched the barn from the porch, not out of fear, but reverence. Something had shifted again. The land was stirring, remembering. The next day, riders appeared, not 200, not armed, just 5. Elder warriors, cloaked in the stories of their people, faces lined like cracked leather, eyes clear as river stone. They didn't speak when they arrived. They simply walked to the barn, each laying something at the foot of the staff. A piece of obsidian, a white shell, a handful of soil, a single yellow flower. Then they turned to Jed and Ash, bowed once, and left without a word. It wasn't a ceremony. It was an inheritance. Jed sat long after they had gone, his hand resting gently on the doorframe. I think they're telling us it's our turn, he murmured. Ash nodded. He didn't need more. He understood. The barn wasn't just a monument to what had happened. It was a charge, a responsibility, not to keep the past alive, but to keep mercy alive. In a world that still burned, that still broke, the barn was a promise that not everything had to. And so, that year, they began writing things down, not just the story of the cup and the warriors, but every soul who came, every offering left, every dream spoken in the barn's quiet shade. Not for glory, not for books, but so one day, when they were both gone, someone else might pick up the thread and continue weaving. Because some stories aren't told. They're lived. Over and over, in silence, in kindness, in dust. The final winter Jed would ever see arrived quiet as a whisper. No blizzards, no warnings, just a gentle hush that settled over the valley like a blanket. His steps had slowed to a shuffle, but he still walked to the barn each morning, hand brushing the weathered boards as if greeting an old friend. Ash walked beside him now, not as a boy, but as a man. And the barn? It stood taller than ever. The staff inside glowed faintly in the early light, surrounded by offerings that spanned a decade. One morning, after a long night of stargazing, Jed didn't rise. Ash found him in his bed, eyes closed, face calm, hands folded like a man who had nothing left to carry. He didn't cry, not at first. Instead, he walked to the barn, opened the doors, and lit a small lantern. He placed it at the foot of the staff, beside the tin cup that had never once been moved. And there, he whispered a single word into the silence. Thank you. The next evening, more people arrived than Dustwell had ever seen. Not by invitation, not by announcement. They simply came. Painted Rock, ranchers, widows, children, strangers. They gathered around the barn with candles and stones and feathers. Some sang, some prayed, others just sat. There were no speeches, no preachers, just presence. And in the heart of it all, Ash stood quietly, carrying the story now, not in his voice, but in his being. The barn was never renamed. never touched by profit or tourism. But those who came knew its truth. They felt it in the air, in the ground, in the silence between breaths. A place where mercy had been given without condition. Where a cup of water became a river that carried hope into 1,000 dry hearts. And now, with Jed gone, the land had passed the torch, not to a hero, but to another guardian. And so, under the endless sky of the frontier, the barn remains. Strong, humble, holy. A whisper in wood and stone that reminds every soul who passes near, kindness never dies. It is remembered. It is multiplied. And when the world burns, as it always will, someone, somewhere, will still offer a cup of water and begin again. In a land shaped by dust and fire, where most men lived with their hands on a rifle and their hearts locked behind loss, one man offered water. Not because it was wise, not because it was safe, but because in that single moment, his soul remembered something older than vengeance, something deeper than fear. Jed Hollis didn't change the world by force. He changed it by mercy. And from that one quiet act, a wave of reverence spread through generations, across boundaries, through bloodlines once stained with hate. What began as a simple gesture, a tin cup in a stranger's hand, became the cornerstone of something sacred. A barn once meant for livestock became a sanctuary for the broken. A staff planted in its center carried more weight than any badge or title. And a boy named Ash, born of silence and second chances, grew into a guardian of legacy not built by gold or guns, but by grace. That's the truth buried beneath the legend. Not that warriors came, but that they left in peace. This story is not about what was lost. It's about what was protected, about the courage to give without knowing the cost, and how the land, yes, even the hard, unforgiving land of the West, remembers those who choose to heal rather than harm. Jed didn't ask to be remembered. He simply acted when no one else would. And that, more than any monument or tale, is what endured. Because what's built from kindness doesn't burn, it roots itself in the soil. So when the wind blows through your own valley, and you face choices where fear tempts you to turn away, remember the man who offered water, the barn that stood through silence, and the riders who came not for war, but for witness. Maybe it wasn't about one man changing everything. Maybe it was about one moment reminding us all what still can be changed, if only we choose to see the stranger in need and reach for the cup instead of the trigger. If this story touched your spirit, let it live beyond this moment. Subscribe to the channel to walk with us through more true legends of courage and grace. Leave your thoughts in the comments, because your voice matters. And if you believe that mercy, even today, can shape the future like it shaped the West, then like this video and share it. Not for numbers, but to pass the flame. Because every fire starts with a single spark.